Good morning, everybody. Like Marcus said, my name is Amanda. It's wonderful to be with you, and it's wonderful to be with you if you're watching online as well. Now, this morning, I want to start with a business pitch. And my business pitch, excuse me, is to the makers of Netflix for a new romantic comedy, otherwise known as the Book of Ruth. And I was Googling romantic comedy plot lines, and this was quite literally the first thing that came up. Slide, please. According to Wikipedia, in a typical romantic comedy, the two lovers need to be kept apart by complicating circumstances, such as class differences, parental interference, a previous partner, until, surmounting all obstacles, they are finally united. And I put it to Netflix that in Ruth, you have a young, likeable woman who is a poor widow residing in a foreign land with a conspiratorial mother-in-law. She falls in love with an eligible bachelor. There are obstacles, but what can stop true love? 10% of the profits will do very nicely to fund my early retirement. However, we are not here this morning for a movie love story. We are not here for that. We are here to celebrate the greatest love story which has ever been known, far greater than the love between a man and a woman. The heart of God to redeem humanity. Because God's love is redemptive. God's love is redemptive. There are only 85 verses in the book of Ruth, but the word redemption is mentioned 23 times. God's love is redemptive. That's what Ruth teaches us. And that redemptive power is worked out in a whole load of different ways. And if you haven't read this book before, I would recommend go home, study it, read it. It's amazing. But there are just two parts of that redemptive love which I want to look at this morning. And the first is God's heart to redeem poverty through practical love. So the Book of Ruth is not a romantic comedy. In fact, if we look a bit deeper, we find that her story is not remotely comedic. But she is a woman of extraordinary faith, despite having lost everything. So to put that in context, if you've never read it before, in chapter 1, we get the background of Ruth's story. And we find that she is a widow from Moab, which is an enemy country to Israel. She has lost her husband and has no children, which in kind of ancient times was a sign of status and a way of family provision for you if you were a woman. And her only family is her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi, who has also lost both her husband and her sons. Naomi decides to return home to Israel, and Ruth refuses to leave her. She puts her faith in God and chooses loyalty and friendship and faith. But this book, it begins with death and poverty and despair. And today is Harvest Sunday, where we celebrate God as the Lord of the harvest, remembering God's provision for us and God's blessing for others. And Ruth's story is also a harvest story. The barley is being brought in. The antihistamines have not been invented yet. And when we find them in chapter 2, these women are so poor that Ruth is reduced to what's called gleaning, which is effectively begging. It's when you pick up the leftover bits of grain that have been dropped when the farmers are bringing in the harvest. And that is also when we meet Boaz. And Boaz is a godly man. If you go to chapter 2, verse 11, he is called a noble character. He greets his harvesters with a blessing in verse 4. And in verse 12, he recognizes that Ruth's loyalty to Naomi is based upon the faith that she has found in God. And when Boaz learns who Ruth is and what she's doing, he tells his men to let her gather freely whatever she needs, even to pull out extra grain for her. He deliberately makes it possible for there to be an abundance of provision for Ruth and for Naomi. So actually, by the end of chapter 2, Ruth has over an ephah of grain. And I looked this up, and apparently that's about 13 kilograms. So that is pretty heavy. And the church, through the ages, has practiced hospitality out of God's heart to share in abundance. And part of that is because we recognize that God is the true Lord of the harvest. And the idea of Harvest Sunday, what we're doing today, goes back a long way because it shows us God's redemptive love. I wonder what comes to mind when you think of the word redeem. It's fascinating what a Google search will give you. This is what I typed in, and the first thing that came up was how to redeem a gift voucher. But in the Old Testament, God is called Israel's Redeemer, not because he gave them gift vouchers, but because God had rescued Israel and restored them to himself. And again in the Old Testament, the Israelites are reminded that the reason they exist is because in their history, God had brought them out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land to live as his people, redeemed and restored from slavery to freedom. And verses like this one in Deuteronomy come up again and again in the Bible. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you. And again, they are asked to celebrate that act of redemption with events like harvest festivals. And under Jewish law, the firstborn belonged to God. And at the harvest, you dedicated the first fruits of your produce to God as a way to worship and as a way of recognizing and remembering God's redemption of you. So this principle of recognizing God's provision and choosing to share that abundance comes from this very old idea that the first and the best belongs to God. And at harvest, we remember to honor God with our own first fruits. That's still the root reason that we give at Harvest Sunday. Now, as far as I'm aware, most of us today are not farmers. Unless you have a particularly abundant veg patch, there are no homegrown crops on that table. So we don't have barley, but we do give to our local food bank. Whether that's nappies or dried pasta or sardines, the principle is the same. We do it to give to the neediest in our community. And we see that same heart to provide for the needy in the story of Ruth and Boaz. Practical love to redeem poverty, to bring transformation. Because God's redeeming love is super practical. And God's heart is for the poor and the needy, for the outcast and the excluded, to bring them in. In Leviticus 19 and in Deuteronomy, God commands that the gleanings of the harvest are to be left for the poor and for the foreigner. And that is exactly what Boaz does in this story. By allowing Ruth to pick up the leftover bits of grain, by not being greedy, he is displaying God's heart to provide for the needy. She is poor, she is a widow with no means of earning her own income, and she is a foreigner. And that is the redemptive heart of God, to provide for the foreigner, to provide for the refugee, to bring abundance and provision where there is poverty and despair. And we, the church today, are also called to practical love, to display God's heart. That's why we run Glassdoor here every year. I'm so excited that we're going to kick it off by praying. That's why we have the Debt Centre Crosslight during the week. That's why we want to say welcome to those who come from other countries out of poverty or war or tragedy. God's heart is to redeem, and he asks us to follow through with practical love. Hello there. God's heart is for the needy. So that is part one at Harvest Festival. And part two is the second part of God's redemptive love. Part two is to restore us into family. And I'm loving the messiness of our church family together this morning. Isn't that beautiful? The work of redemption is to show us God's heart, to put the lonely into families. You know, in this story, it's made abundantly clear that Ruth is an outsider. In chapter 1, Naomi tells her that there is no place for her in Israel. In chapter 2, it begins by calling her Ruth the Moabitess in verse 2. And then again in verse 21, she calls herself a foreigner as well. And then in chapter 3, everything changes. And the way that happens, again, Netflix, if you want my number, is as in any good movie, before a proposal, there's a makeover. This slide is taken from Clueless, one of my favourite Jane Austen adaptations. It's worth a watch. But in chapter 3, Ruth, as in any good film, she has a makeover. She bathes and perfumes herself and puts on her best dress. And then she approaches the threshing floor, where Boaz is lying down to sleep in good spirits after the harvest party. And she lies at his feet, and it all gets a bit weird. There's a foot, eat that Cinderella, and a cloak. And hey presto, chapter 4, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby, yada, yada, yada. But the second aspect of God's redemption is to restore us into family again. Ruth, the ultimate outsider, is brought in. And Naomi, the grieving widow, her family line is restored. And I'm going to get a bit theological here, so bear with me, because there are 3 words in Hebrew which are used to describe redemption. And the main one that is in this story is when Boaz is called this funny phrase. And in your Bibles it says guardian redeemer, but a better translation of that is kinsman redeemer. And the Hebrew comes from this word gel. Gel, which means to redeem by buying back. And that is how Boaz is described in the Book of Ruth. He is the girl, the kinsman redeemer. Again, very specific, very practical love. When a family member is a kinsman redeemer, they have the unique responsibility to act for a relative who has fallen upon hard times. And they can buy back their lost family property and redeem their family line, which is exactly what Boaz does here by marrying Ruth. And again, this role is found in the ancient law of Israel, again showing God's heart that no one should be left behind. The kinsman redeemer is the one who prevents anyone from sinking into total poverty or bondage to slavery, which is often what that entailed, bringing them back into family and restoring them from exclusion. But they don't have to do it. It's their choice. And Boaz gets proposed to. Ruth proposes to Boaz, which I love. And for Ruth to do that is not without personal vulnerability. You know, if this were the movie of the Book of Ruth, this would be like the climax bit. The music would be going, it would be quite sort of slow and moody. It'll be kind of, ooh, will they, won't they? Will it could all go wrong, is it going to go right? And if anyone sees her there in the middle of the night on the threshing floor, there will be gossip. She could lose all of her social standing as an honourable woman, which as a foreign widow is already pretty vulnerable. But she approaches Boaz with great courage and invites him to be her kinsman redeemer. By doing so, she has to make herself humble. She has to admit her need first and make herself even more vulnerable to him by lying at his feet, uncovering his foot and asking him to lay his cloak over her and cover her, which is all a bit weird. And we don't get this action of lying at his feet. But in the ancient Middle Eastern culture, that's the invitation to be the kinsman redeemer. And here it is the equivalent of going down on one knee. And for a woman to do that to a man then is even harder than I think it is for us to do that now. She is placing herself at the mercy of Boaz. And he responds with loving kindness. And what we see here is vulnerability and mercy. And I wonder when the last time was that you felt vulnerable, what your deepest need is. Because what we see here is that God responds to our need. Our vulnerability elicits his heart of compassion and mercy. Did God have to do it? No. but in his mercy, he responds to our need. In the Old Testament, God is Israel's kinsman redeemer, who identifies with them as the relative who brings back what was in bondage to slavery and restores it to freedom. And then in the New Testament, God gives his own firstborn son as the ultimate act of love. Jesus is our redeemer too, who identifies with us and restores us at the cost of his own life. In Hebrews 2:11, it states that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. By becoming human, Jesus identifies with us. He is not only our redeemer from sin, but he is a kinsman to us. He understands our struggles. And where we are vulnerable, that brings out his compassion. And he pays the ultimate price by going to the cross to bring us into the family of God, where we find identity and meaning and purpose. Because God's heart to restore shows us the redemptive power of his love. It transforms. And I love this story. We have barrenness from Naomi and Ruth giving way to new birth. We have an excluded foreigner brought into a family, given belonging. A widow becomes a wife. Grief is replaced by joy, bitterness to worship, and poverty is transformed by abundant provision. That is the power of redemption, to restore brokenness. And there is one more word in Hebrew to describe the work of redemption, and that word is kapar, which means to cover. And we relate that to Jesus, who has covered over our sins, and that's super important. But I think Ruth shows us another aspect of that covering, because we sometimes run the risk of treating the work of redemption in a slightly transactional way, like redeeming a gift voucher. Jesus has paid for my sin, and that is true, and hallelujah, and I bet my life on that. But the heart of God is deeper than simply redeeming us like a gift voucher. That's not enough for God. There's a depth to being covered by God, which I think we see in Ruth. And the image I want to use to describe this best is that of a mother covering her chicks underneath her wings. And this is how God is described. In chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz recognizes and responds to Ruth's faith, which she has sought by making God her refuge. And this is what he says: "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And again, this image of taking refuge beneath the protective wings of God comes up in the Bible, literally like the protective wings of a mother covering her chicks. That is the image used to describe God as our Redeemer. And it's the same image that comes up again in chapter 3, when Ruth does this weird, slightly humiliating thing of lying at Boaz's feet. She says, "I am your servant, Ruth." But then it's not humiliating at all. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." God's redeeming love is deeply practical. We see that in the provision and the care to bring transformation to the poor and to the needy. God's redeeming love is salvific. He has brought us back from bondage to sin and covered us with his love. But God's redeeming love is also holistic. It is not enough to simply save us. God also desires to restore us, to heal us, to set us free. And he does that as a parent caring for a child. He shares that invitation to be brought into his big family. And that is what we celebrate this morning at church, being one family of God, where outsiders are brought in, no matter who you are, no matter where you've come from. We were all once outsiders, but through God's great mercy, we have been brought into the family of God. And if you read the end of chapter 4, there is a family tree. The Bible has a lot of genealogies in it, which are always the bits that we skip over, but this one is really fascinating. We see that the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz is King David, the great king of Israel, who is also an ancestor of Jesus. So Ruth, who is from Moab, becomes a mother of Jesus. Jesus is our kinsman. He became a human for us. And when he went to the cross to buy us back, he became our Redeemer. He has covered us with his love, and he welcomes us into his family, just as Ruth and Naomi are restored and redeemed into family and away from poverty. So this morning, where are you at? Some of us are here in the spirit of celebration. We know the abundance that we've received, and we are more than happy to share it and to celebrate it. Some of us will be here and actually we're in need. Maybe we need that practical help. Some of us may be feeling vulnerable, but are fearful of asking for mercy. And maybe you're none of those things. Maybe you don't even know how you got here this morning. But wherever you are, God chose you. And could I have that picture again? Thank you, Micah. This is his heart for you, to restore you and bring you back into the big family of God. And there is nowhere safer than under those wings. So we're going to have a time of worship. So could I ask the band to come back up?